The wood splintered 2 houses down, then a scream, sudden, sharp, and silenced. I reached for my husband in the dark, but his side of the bed was already cold. When our door exploded inward, it wasn't just wood that broke, it was my world. Torchlight blinded me. Hands like iron clamped over my mouth, dragging me toward a sky choked with ash and the stench of burning thatch. By dawn, the salt spray of the sea replaced the smoke of my home. I was in chains, and the horizon was swallowing everything I'd ever loved. Now let me tell you where this happened. The year was 1631. The place was Baltimore, a tiny fishing village on the southern coast of Ireland. It wasn't a city. It wasn't strategic. It was just a handful of cottages perched on rocks above the Atlantic, where people fished, farmed, and lived quiet lives. On the night of June 20th, 237 people were taken from their beds. Men, women, children, some as young as 7 years old. They were dragged through the streets in chains while their homes collapsed into ash behind them. By sunrise, every single one of them was aboard ships sailing south. And the men who took them, they weren't outlaws. They weren't rogue criminals operating in the shadows. They were state-sponsored raiders working for one of the most powerful empires on earth, the Ottoman Empire. These were the Barbary corsairs, and for over 2.5 centuries, they turned the Mediterranean and the Atlantic coastlines into hunting grounds. The prey? Europeans, more than 1 million of them, captured and sold into a system so vast, so organized, and so brutal that it's almost impossible to believe Europe let it happen. But they did. And what happened to the women, especially the young ones, is the part history tried to bury. Among those taken from Baltimore was a young woman named Joan Broadbrook. She had never left her village, never seen a map, never imagined that men from a continent she didn't know existed would come for her while she slept. 3 weeks later, Joan was standing on a stone platform in a slave market in Algiers. Around her, men circled slowly. They weren't looking at her face. They were evaluating her body the way you'd evaluate livestock at a fair. One man stepped closer. He squeezed her arm, testing the muscle. Another forced her mouth open, inspecting her teeth. A third ran his hands down her sides, her hips, her legs. She tried to pull away. A slaver behind her struck her across the shoulders with a leather strap and barked something she didn't understand. She learned quickly. Resistance earned pain. Stillness earned nothing, but at least it didn't make things worse. Joan was sold that day for the equivalent of 8 oxen. Not a high price. A decent horse cost more, but she was young, healthy, and European, and that made her valuable in a very specific way. Before we go any further, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching this from. It's honestly incredible to me that a story this dark, this buried, somehow finds its way to people across every continent. History has a way of traveling. To understand what happened to Joan, you need to understand who took her. The Barbary corsairs weren't pirates in the romantic sense. They weren't Jack Sparrow. They were military-grade raiders operating out of 4 major port cities along the North African coast: Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, and Salé. Each of these cities was either directly controlled by the Ottoman Empire or operating under its protection. And the Ottomans didn't just allow the raids, they profited from them. Every slave sold in these markets generated tax revenue that flowed straight into the Sultan's treasury. This wasn't crime, it was policy. The corsairs sailed in fleets, sometimes 30 ships at a time. They had intelligence networks that told them which villages had weak defenses, which fishing boats ventured too far from shore, which merchant ships carried women and children. They struck at night, or at dawn, when people were asleep or just waking. They moved fast. By the time anyone realized what was happening, it was already over. In 1627, Barbary corsairs reached Iceland, the northernmost edge of Europe. 400 people were captured from remote fishing villages, places so isolated that most Europeans didn't even know they existed. Imagine being an Icelandic farmer, waking to men shouting in Arabic, dragging you from your bed in a place where foreign visitors were almost unheard of. In 1544, the corsair Hayreddin Barbarossa raided the Italian coast and captured 7,000 people in one summer. 7,000. That's not a raid, that's an industry. In 1554, corsairs attacked the Spanish town of Vieste and emptied it in a single night. 6,000 people taken. The entire town. For 250 years, this was the reality for anyone living near the Mediterranean or the Atlantic coasts of Europe. Every night, you went to sleep wondering if tonight was the night, if you'd hear the screaming, if by morning, you'd be in chains. Entire villages were abandoned. Coastal populations moved inland, away from the reach of the corsairs. Watchtowers were built along every shoreline. Churches installed bells to sound the alarm. But warnings didn't always help. The corsairs adapted, they learned, they waited for storms that kept fishing boats in harbor. They bribed criminals for inside information. And some Europeans, called renegades, actually joined them. These were men who converted, learned the trade, and guided raids against their own countrymen. The most famous was a Dutchman named Simon Dancer, or Simon the Dancer. He became one of the wealthiest corsairs in Algiers. He personally captured thousands of Europeans and sold them in the markets. Nationality meant nothing when gold was involved. Let me tell you about another woman. Her name was Maria Terellen. She was Dutch, 22 years old, traveling on a merchant ship near the Spanish coast in 1731. At dawn, corsairs boarded the vessel. They killed the older men immediately, useless for labor, useless for sale. Their bodies went overboard without ceremony. The younger men were chained, all the women were chained. Then the ship turned south. Maria spent 17 days in the cargo hold. She was chained to 40 other women in a space so tight they couldn't lie down. They sat hunched against each other in total darkness. The air was thick with the smell of vomit, urine, unwashed bodies, and fear. No light, no fresh air. Just the creak of the ship and the sound of women crying in languages she didn't understand. Some women died during the crossing. Maria heard the splashes when their bodies were thrown into the sea. She counted 7. One woman chained next to her stopped eating on the 3rd day, stopped drinking on the 5th. By the 8th, she was gone. Maria sat chained to her corpse for hours before anyone came to remove it. When the ship finally reached Algiers, they dragged her up onto the deck. She hadn't seen sunlight in over 2 weeks. The brightness felt like knives in her eyes. When her vision cleared, the first thing she saw was the gleaming white walls of Algiers rising against the blue sky. The second thing she saw was the slave market. The process was efficient. Captives were taken to public baths and washed. Their wounds were treated just enough to keep them alive until the sale. Then they were sorted. Strong young men went to manual labor or the galleys, rowing ships in chains until their bodies gave out. Most galley slaves died within 5 years. Educated men were sold as tutors or craftsmen. Children were trained as servants. Some were converted and raised in the faith of their captors, growing up never knowing their real names or where they came from. Women over 35 went to domestic work, cooking, cleaning, invisible labor in wealthy households. But young women between 15 and 30, they were the most valuable merchandise in the entire market. And they were destined for one place, the harem. Before the sale came the inspection. Women were placed on elevated platforms in the center of the market. Buyers circled them. They squeezed arms and legs to check for strength. They forced mouths open to inspect teeth. They examined skin for disease or defects. And in many markets, especially in Algiers and Tunis, women were stripped completely. Full display. Nothing hidden. Buyers touched whatever they wanted to touch, ran their hands over bodies that didn't belong to them, verified their investment. A French priest named Pierre Dan worked in Algiers in 1634, ransoming Christian captives. He documented what he witnessed. He wrote that young Christian women were displayed naked in public squares, inspected like animals. Buyers touched them everywhere to verify their health. The women cried, but resistance was met with immediate beatings. The slavers struck them until they learned that crying changed nothing. This wasn't hidden. It happened in broad daylight, in public squares, witnessed by thousands. Completely legal, completely normal. Now imagine being Joan Broadbrook standing on that platform. A girl from a tiny Irish village where her biggest worry had been whether the fishing nets would hold. Where she'd never been alone with a man who wasn't family. Now strangers were examining her body, speaking a language that sounded like noise, deciding her worth in a currency she didn't understand. She was sold to a Turkish merchant named Ahmed. She had no idea what that meant. No idea that Ahmed already owned 7 other slaves. No idea that her life as she had known it was over forever. The journey from Algiers to Istanbul took 6 weeks. Joan was kept in another cargo hold with 20 other European women. Italians, Spanish, French, Greek. None of them spoke English. But fear needed no translation. They all knew what was waiting. When they arrived, Joan was taken directly to Ahmed's house. The other slaves removed her European clothes and burned them. Everything from her old life, gone. They bathed her in perfumed water, dressed her in Ottoman silks. She didn't recognize herself in the polished bronze mirror they held up. That night, Ahmed came to her room. Joan had never been with a man. In her village, such things happened after marriage, with someone you chose. Someone who knew your name and spoke your language. Ahmed spoke no English. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. Years later, Joan managed to send a letter back to Ireland, one of the only surviving first-hand accounts from a captured Irish woman. In it, she wrote that she could not describe what she suffered that first night, only that she wished for death 1,000 times. But death did not come, and every night after was the same. That was the reality of the harem, not silk and luxury, not the romantic paintings European artists created without ever seeing the places they depicted. Captivity, forced submission, survival, and the psychological horror of knowing this was forever. No rescue was coming. No army marching to save you. No hope of seeing home again. Just endless days turning into endless years. Some women went mad. They screamed at walls, talked to people who weren't there. The other slaves restrained them until they exhausted themselves. The ones who couldn't be controlled were sold away or simply disappeared. Others survived by going numb. It was easier that way. They created small rituals to give structure to shapeless time. They remembered songs from home, recipes their mothers made, the sound of rain on thatch. Anything to hold on to who they had been. But most just learned to stop feeling. Daily life depended entirely on the owner. But patterns were universal. First, every Christian slave was pressured constantly to convert. Conversion didn't make them free. They remained property. But it improved their status slightly within the household. Those who resisted were punished. Beatings, food deprivation, isolation in dark rooms for weeks. Second, they were forced to learn Turkish or Arabic. Those who learned quickly received better treatment. Those who didn't were labeled stubborn and punished more severely. Third, and this is crucial, no European slave had legal rights. She could not testify in court, could not own property, could not refuse her owner anything, could not leave the house without permission. She was, in every legal sense, an object. Most women ended up in one of 3 situations: brutal domestic labor, 16-hour days of cooking, cleaning, childcare. A burned meal could mean a beating. A broken dish could mean no food for days. These women rarely saw the outside. They aged rapidly. When they could no longer work, they were sold to poorer buyers or abandoned. Concubinage. If the woman was young and attractive, her owner used her whenever he wanted. In wealthy households, there were multiple concubines competing for favor. If a concubine bore a son, her status improved. But daughters were worth less. Too many failures, and she'd be sold or demoted. And resale. Many slaves were bought and sold multiple times. Each sale was a new trauma, a new public inspection, a new owner, a new set of cruelties to navigate. Some women were sold 5, 6, 10 times in their lives. But there was one destination feared above all others, the imperial harem of the Ottoman Sultan in Istanbul. The harem wasn't a single building. It was a massive complex inside the Topkapi Palace. Over 400 rooms, courtyards, baths, gardens. At its peak, it held between 500 and 1,000 women. Most weren't European. They were Circassian and Georgian slaves from the Caucasus, considered the most beautiful by Ottoman standards. But Europeans were there, a rare and valuable minority. To reach the imperial harem, a slave had to be extraordinarily beautiful and young, usually between 12 and 18. She had to survive a brutal selection process. The Sultan's agents roamed slave markets across the empire, searching for candidates. They bought the most promising and brought them to the palace for further evaluation, physical inspections, tests of temperament, learning ability, the ability to please. Most were rejected. Only a small fraction was accepted. Once inside, training began. It lasted years. They learned Turkish, Ottoman etiquette, music, dance, embroidery, calligraphy. They were taught how to walk, how to speak, how to look at a man and how to look away. The goal was to transform them into refined companions worthy of the Sultan. But here's the truth that shatters every fantasy. Of the 500 to 1,000 women living in the imperial harem, only a fraction, maybe 50 or 100, would ever see the Sultan in person. And of those, only a handful, perhaps 5 to 10 in an entire generation, would spend the night with him. The rest lived in permanent limbo, not free, but not serving the purpose for which they were captured. They spent years, sometimes decades, waiting for a summons that never came. Growing older in gilded rooms, watching their beauty fade. Knowing that with each passing year, their chances disappeared. And when a sultan died, all women who hadn't borne his children were transferred to the old palace, a separate complex where they lived out the rest of their lives in even deeper isolation. They never left, never married, never had children. They simply existed behind walls until death. Ottoman records mention a European slave identified only as Francesca. She entered the harem in 1650 at 15 years old. She died there in 1702 at 67, 52 years inside those walls. She never saw the Sultan, not once, never left the complex. Her only function for 5 decades was serving women of higher rank. When she died, she was buried in a cemetery for palace slaves. No name on the grave, only a number. The administrative record listed her as slave number 847. Origin, Frankish. Status, deceased. Cause, advanced age. 52 years, reduced to a number and 2 words. So why did Europe allow this to continue for 250 years? The answer is shameful. Europe was divided. Religious wars between Catholics and Protestants consumed every resource. States didn't cooperate against the corsairs because they were too busy fighting each other. Some European powers, Venice, France, had profitable trade agreements with the Ottoman Empire. They didn't want to risk those relationships over captured peasants. And some Europeans profited directly. Renegades got rich. Merchants traded goods regardless of where they came from. Ransoming captives became its own industry. But the ransom system was slow, bureaucratic, and favored the wealthy. A rich merchant's daughter might be freed within a year. A poor fisherman's wife might wait forever. Most waited forever. Maria Terellen was one of the lucky ones. After 8 years in captivity, her family sold everything they owned and raised 200 Dutch florins, a fortune. She was freed in 1739 and returned to Holland. But when she arrived, she discovered her fiancé had married someone else. Her mother had died of grief 2 years after her capture. Her father was financially ruined, and her community rejected her. They saw her as contaminated, dishonored. No one wanted to marry a woman who had been a slave. The assumptions about what had happened to her, true or not, marked her forever. Maria lived the rest of her life alone, working as a seamstress. In her diary, preserved in Dutch archives, she wrote that she would have preferred to die in captivity than return to this life. At least there, her shame was private. Here, it was public and eternal. The system only ended in the 19th century, when France began bombing corsair bases. In 1830, they invaded Algeria and dismantled the slave markets for good. But by then, over 1 million people had been captured. The vast majority never came home. Joan Broadbrook spent years in captivity. When she was finally freed and tried to return to Ireland, Baltimore was a shadow of itself. Her family was gone. Her home was gone. The life she remembered existed only in her memory. Her family in Ireland never knew what happened to her. For decades, her name was read aloud in Baltimore's church during prayers for the captives. Every Sunday, her name spoken into the air. Every Sunday, silence. Eventually, they stopped saying it. She was forgotten. This isn't just the story of Joan, or Maria, or Francesca. It's the story of over 1 million European women whose lives were stolen by a system that operated openly, legally, and profitably for centuries. The coasts of Ireland still remember the night of 1631. The archives of Istanbul still hold the names of slaves in ledgers no one reads. The watchtowers still stand along the Mediterranean, empty now, staring out at a sea that once carried so much suffering. And now you remember too. Because some stories don't need a moral. They just need to be told.